In October of 2007, the last worker on the factory floor in Newton, Iowa, clocked out of a plant that had been running, almost without interruption, for more than 100 years. No ceremony, no gold watch, just an empty building where, at its peak, more than 3,000 people used to work. This was Maytag. For most of a century, the name meant one thing above all else, something that simply did not break. Parents bought it because their parents had bought it. Repair shops barely stocked parts for it because there was rarely any reason to. For 4 decades, Maytag had run one of the most successful advertising campaigns in American television history, built entirely around the idea that its repairman had nothing to do because Maytag appliances simply didn't break. That repairman was so lonely, so bored, so famous that most Americans could picture his face without ever having owned a single Maytag product. And in Newton, Iowa, the town Maytag had built its entire identity around, there was even a company slogan that put it plainly: Newton needs Maytag. By the end of 2007, Newton didn't have Maytag anymore. This is the story of how a company built its whole reputation on one word: reliable, and how that same reputation couldn't save the town that made it true. The story starts with farm equipment, not laundry. In 1893, a man named Frederick Maytag partnered with an inventor named George Parsons and 2 brothers-in-law to start a company in Newton, Iowa. Their product had nothing to do with washing clothes. It was an attachment for threshing machines designed to feed grain more safely into the blades. Maytag himself wasn't just a businessman. He'd go on to serve as Newton's mayor, as an Iowa state senator, and eventually as the state's very first director of the budget. Whatever else you want to say about him, the man believed in showing up for his town. There was just one problem. Farm equipment sales were seasonal. For months at a time, the factory sat mostly idle. So in 1907, looking for something to build during the off-season, the company tried something new, a simple wooden tub clothes washer they called the Pastime. It worked well enough that 2 years later, Maytag bought out his partners, renamed the whole operation after himself, and bet the company's future on washing machines instead of farm equipment. That wasn't his only side venture. Around the same time, Maytag briefly tried building automobiles too, through a company called Maytag Mason, with early engineering help from 2 brothers who'd later become legendary in their own right, the Duesenbergs. The car business folded within a couple of years. The washing machines did not. For the next 15 years, Maytag chased one specific engineering problem: how do you get clothes actually clean without tearing them apart? Most washers of the era used friction, paddles and boards rubbing against fabric, wearing it down over time. In 1922, Maytag's engineers cracked something better. They called it the Gyrafoam, a washer that cleaned using water action alone, gently pulling clothes through the water instead of grinding them against it. It worked. By the mid-1920s, roughly 1 out of every 5 washing machines sold in America carried the Maytag name. In 1925, the company went public on the New York Stock Exchange. 2 years after that, it built its 1 millionth washing machine. A farm equipment side project had become one of the biggest appliance makers in the country. For the next several decades, Maytag built something almost as valuable as the washers themselves: a reputation. Then, in 1967, an advertising agency in Chicago turned that reputation into one of the most effective marketing ideas in American history. The concept was almost embarrassingly simple. Show a Maytag repairman sitting alone in an empty service office, bored out of his mind because nobody's machine ever needed fixing. Audiences called him "Old Lonely." Actor Jesse White played him for the next 21 years, staring at a silent phone that never rang. It became the longest-running advertising character campaign in the history of American television. Decades later, people who had never purchased a single Maytag appliance could still describe the joke. That's not just good advertising. That's a brand becoming part of the culture itself. The role even outlived the actors who played it. When Jesse White stepped down in 1988, Gordon Jump, familiar to millions from his role on WKRP in Cincinnati, picked up the same silent phone in 1989 and kept staring at it for another 14 years. In 1986, Maytag added a sidekick to the campaign, a basset hound who sat beside the lonely repairman, keeping him company. They named the dog Newton. It wasn't subtle.
The company's hometown and its most famous mascot now shared a name, reinforcing a message the town had built its whole identity around. Newton needs Maytag. For most of the 20th century, that wasn't just a slogan. It was simply true.
By the 1990s, Maytag Corporation had grown well beyond washing machines, adding brands like Jenn-Air, Hoover, and Amana to its portfolio, pushing annual revenue toward $4.7 billion. On paper, this looked like exactly the kind of diversification a smart, mature company was supposed to pursue. More brands, more categories, more shelf space in more stores. From the outside, everything still looked like the same dependable company from the commercials. Underneath, cracks were forming. In the late 1990s, Maytag introduced a new front-loading washer called the Neptune, meant to showcase the company's engineering leadership for a new generation. Instead, it became a case study in the opposite. Customers reported persistent odor problems, mechanical failures, and repair costs that sometimes rivaled buying a whole new machine. Consumer advocates started actively warning shoppers away from the very brand that had spent decades telling America it never needed a repairman in the first place. The irony was almost too perfect. The company whose entire identity was built on a repairman with nothing to do now had actual repairmen showing up at actual houses, more often than anyone at Maytag wanted to admit. Customer satisfaction scores slid. Market share slid with them. Quality problems were only part of the pressure. Big box retailers were squeezing margins across the entire appliance industry, and cheaper imported competitors were entering the market just as Maytag's costs and its reputation were both moving in the wrong direction at once. By 2004, the warning signs weren't subtle anymore. Newton was full of unflattering analyst reports, worker strikes, and rounds of layoffs hitting both union and non-union employees.
A company that had defined its hometown for over a century suddenly looked vulnerable. And vulnerable companies, in industries built around scale, tend not to stay independent for long. In 2005, with Maytag's stock price and customer satisfaction scores both near historic lows, the bids started coming in. A private equity firm called Ripplewood Holdings made an offer. Then Haier, an arm of a major Chinese appliance manufacturer, a bid that, had it succeeded, would have put an American manufacturing icon under Chinese ownership. For a company built on the phrase "made reliable in America," that possibility alone made national headlines. Then Maytag's biggest domestic rival stepped in. Whirlpool. Haier withdrew its bid within days. Whirlpool's offer, $1.37 billion, later finalized around $1.7 billion, won. On April 1, 2006, the acquisition closed. Maytag, independent since 1893, belonged to its former competitor. The math behind the deal was straightforward, even if nobody at Whirlpool put it quite this bluntly in public. Two competing appliance makers, each running their own separate factories, distribution networks, and headquarters, could be squeezed into one, with a lot less overhead. In May of 2006, just weeks after the deal closed, Whirlpool announced what that squeeze would actually look like. Roughly 4,500 jobs eliminated across the combined companies. Plant closures in Newton, Iowa, in Searcy, Arkansas, in Illinois. Administrative offices consolidated. It was about 6% of the entire combined North American workforce, gone in a single announcement. Whirlpool framed all of it in the careful language companies use for these moments: synergies, efficiencies, right-sizing the combined footprint. Behind each of those words was a specific town, a specific plant, and thousands of specific people finding out their job was one of the ones being eliminated. For most of the towns on that list, a plant closure was a serious blow. For Newton, it was something closer to an identity crisis. At its peak, Maytag had employed more than 3,000 people in Newton, in a town of roughly 15,000 residents. That's not just a major employer. That's more than 1 out of every 5 people in town working for the same company, in the same industry, in the same handful of buildings. Generations of the same families worked those same production lines, a grandfather, then a father, then a son, all punching the same time clock in the same building across 60 or 70 years. That kind of continuity doesn't show up on a balance sheet. It shows up in a town's entire sense of who it is. Throughout 2006 and into 2007, the Newton plant wound down in stages. Whole departments, whole shifts, whole decades of institutional knowledge walking out the door a little at a time.
Workers who'd spent their entire adult lives on that factory floor now faced retirement on fixed incomes in a local economy that no longer had much use for the specific skills they'd spent decades mastering. A Whirlpool spokesperson later explained the decision the way corporate decisions usually get explained. The company had looked at every element of the Newton operation and made choices based on cost, quality, and distribution. Newton, in that calculation, didn't make the cut. By October of 2007, the very last worker on the factory floor clocked out for good. The town didn't fall apart, but it didn't stay the same either.
Maytag's old headquarters building found a new tenant, a telecommunications company. A new local speedway opened, part of an effort to diversify an economy that had leaned on one employer for over 100 years. City leaders talked openly about rebuilding Newton's identity around something other than a single manufacturer: wind energy, other light industry, anything that didn't require betting the whole town on one company's fortunes ever again. Newton's Chamber of Commerce tried to strike a tone of cautious resilience. It would be painful, they said. Painful for some, somewhat painful for everyone, but the town would be fine. Whether fine ever quite felt the same as Maytag Town is a harder question to answer. Whirlpool didn't kill the Maytag brand. If anything, it kept investing in it. Appliances with the Maytag name are still sold today in stores all over the country. But within about a year of the acquisition, Whirlpool did retire the entire premise the brand had been built on. The lonely, bored repairman with nothing to do quietly disappeared, replaced by a younger, more modern spokesman meant to sell engineering quality instead of pure reliability. Whirlpool ran a nationwide casting search for the role, drawing more than 1,500 hopefuls. The winner wasn't even an actor by trade. He'd been working in real estate before landing the most famous repairman job in American advertising, on what he later admitted was basically a whim. The joke had run for 40 years. Whirlpool decided it was time for a rebrand. There's something almost too perfectly ironic about how this story ends. A company spent decades building a reputation around a fictional repairman who never had anything to fix.
In the end, it was the company itself that broke down, not because its washers stopped working, but because it couldn't keep pace with a market moving faster than its own reputation could carry it. And when the company that finally caught up decided to buy it, nobody sent a repairman. They just turned off the lights in Newton, Iowa, and let 100 years of history go quiet. Somewhere out there, a Maytag washer built decades ago is probably still running in someone's basement, long after the factory that built it stopped existing. That machine never needed Old Lonely to fix it. It's the town he was named after that could have used the help.